Welcome. I'm Jeff Sayre-McCord. I'm the director of UNC's Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program. I encourage you, if you're interested in the kind of issues that arise when you look at the intersection of questions of justice and rights and liberty and political institutions and economic structures, if that intersection interests you, come look at PPE, look at our extracurricular programming, our reading groups, our talks, our weekend workshops, and feel free to talk to anyone involved about the program to see if there are opportunities that will be appealing. One of the things we do is run sort of topic-motivated talks and salons. When an issue comes up in the news and there's reason to think it's much more complicated than people think, we try to get a salon going or a talk. And it was with that idea that I reached out to someone who I knew of decades ago because he was an extremely close friend and a close friend of mine, Blair, who was an extraordinary English professor, student of literature, colleague, and administrator. I just admired him no end. Someone today, when I was finishing the talk, joked to me about Admiral having been described once as endlessly diplomatic. And I think that's true. I mean, it's not that he wouldn't take a stand. It's not that he wouldn't work hard to make good things happen. It's not that he wouldn't stand for things, but you always knew you were being respected and taken seriously, and that he was adjusting what he was doing in light of the arguments you gave him. He would tell me about his friend, as he called him, Dennis, who he met at Oxford, and what an extraordinary mind he had, and what a really astounding career. I'm not going to provide the litany of Admiral Dennis Blair's career. I'm going to just mention two things that should convince you this man knows stuff. And the stuff he knows, to the extent he can share it with us, will be enlightening. So he was, for most of his life, in the Navy. And he ended that part of his career as the commander of the Pacific. Then after that, it's not that he retired, he became, among other important things, the Director of National Intelligence. And in that role, now outside of the military, but not outside of access to important information about what's happening in the world, he was, among other things, extremely interested in what was happening in Asia, in China, in Japan, and how it would affect the interests and future of humankind. So it's my pleasure to introduce do you say former Admiral or just Admiral? Dennis.
Dennis works fine.
But it's my pleasure to introduce Dennis. I can't do it. Blair, please join me in welcoming him. I should mention that after the talk there will be pizza. Just if you're planning things.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. As you mentioned, we had a common friend in Darryl Bless, and he attempted to recruit me to teach here at UNC back in 2002 when I left the Navy. It didn't quite work out, but I finally made it here 20 years later, and I'm extremely happy. I teach in the Peace, War, and Defense curriculum here at Chapel Hill, and like PPE, this is a field that tries to bring together the knowledge and the discipline of different traditional academic disciplines. And the purpose is to build a deeper understanding of complex and important areas of human activity that simply cannot be bounded by a single academic field. And I firmly believe that if we are to make progress on the important questions that face countries, their publics, their governments, both leaders and citizens need to draw on all the tools of the academic toolkit. So it's a pleasure to be talking with PPE students on an important topic, a dynamic topic like the Asia-Pacific region. And this evening I'll start my talk with a discussion of the recent Australia, UK, US Enhanced Security Agreement, which you may have read about in the news and the controversy that it caused. It triggered strong negative reactions from China, which was part of the whole idea, and from France, which was not part of the whole idea. But then I want to move to the larger picture of the Asia-Pacific region. In it, China's rise, China's challenge to the existing, generally American-dominated geopolitical environment can only be understood across the disciplines of history, politics, philosophy, economics, culture, sociology. And spoiler alert, I think it is the first P, philosophy, that probably holds the key to understanding. It's, in my mind, the most important factor that's at play now in the Asia-Pacific region. But first to this awkwardly acronym AUKUS, or AUKUS, or however it's pronounced in the government these days. As usual, the volume of commentary on AUKUS exceeds by many times the authoritative publications on it. In fact, all that has been officially published is a single page on September 15th, the Joint Leaders Statement on AUKUS. And it's always useful to go back to the source before you join the commentary, so I will draw from it. According to the joint statement signed by the leaders of all three countries, the United States, France, or the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, it is an enhanced trilateral security partnership. Enhanced trilateral security partnership, whatever that is. In fact, it's a pretty soft and squishy term when you consider that the United States and the United Kingdom are full members of NATO, a security alliance which robustly declares that an attack on one is an attack on all in its Article 5. And the United States and Australia are full members of the AUKUS Treaty, Article 4 of which declares each party recognizes that an armed attack in the Pacific on any of the parties would be dangerous to its own peace and safety, and declares that it would act to meet the common danger in accordance with its constitutional processes. So, although the Joint Leaders Statement states that we will significantly deepen cooperation on a range of security and defense capabilities, this new partnership really provides little new in the way of fundamental binding trilateral security policy. The statement does, however, provide new goals for military hardware cooperation. The final two-thirds of that one-page statement concern defense technology cooperation, beginning with what is termed a shared ambition to support Australia in acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. And then the statement goes on beyond submarines to promise trilateral cooperation on cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, quantum capabilities, and additional undersea capabilities. I think we need to be honest about what cooperation means in these areas. It is the United States that has the technology and the weapon systems in all of these areas. And it is Australia and the United Kingdom that would like to acquire them. So the essence of the agreement is a commitment by the United States to make nuclear ship propulsion, cyber, artificial intelligence, and quantum technology available to Australia and the United Kingdom. along with this real core of the statement, the essential defense technology part, the context and the implications are also important. When I was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command some 20 years ago, I talked about the development of security networks in addition to the more traditional Pacific hub and spoke security model. The aggressive posture that China has pursued, especially since President Xi Jinping's assumption of office in 2012, has tended to reinforce this traditional hub and spoke model. The United States is the hub, U.S. allies are the spokes, and each individual spoke is connected to the hub by a bilateral treaty. The U.S.-Japan Treaty, the U.S. Republic of Korea Treaty, the U.S.-Australia Treaty, the U.S.-Philippines Treaty, and so on. Each American ally, as it has felt more threatened by China, works to reinvigorate and reinforce its security relationship, its bilateral security relationship with the United States. However, an overlay of networks has also grown up to connect multiple hubs, multiple spokes with the hub, and sometimes the spokes with each other in multilateral security arrangements. These include things like the Quad, which is an arrangement among US, India, Australia, and Japan that sometimes includes combined military exercises. Closer US, Australia, Japan military cooperation, or just Australia, Japan military cooperation. A series of trilateral US, Republic of Korea, Japan military diplomatic consultations, and non-military cooperative programs with some military potential among ASEAN countries and each other and the United States. Now, almost all of these networks follow the Harry Potter Voldemort rule. That is, China is he who is not to be mentioned, or he who is not to be named. They are generally scrupulous not to identify China as irrational or as a threat. However, unofficial statements and all the commentary make it clear that as a minimum, they are intended to demonstrate solidarity against what they consider Chinese aggressive activities in recent years. And taken as a whole, they form a web of security arrangements and activities among these countries that feel threatened by Chinese activities and in the hopes of constraining Chinese influence. Now, the inclusion of the United Kingdom in the UK-EU-US security agreement marks the first time that a European country has joined in one of these networks. So on a diplomacy scorecard, that counts as a significant win, showing that China's aggressive policies are causing countries far from the Asia-Pacific to join in these Pacific-centered security arrangements. These networks contribute to Chinese frustration and to a sense that there is a US-led campaign to enlist other countries in a coalition to diminish what China regards as its rightful due as its power increases. Now, China reacted quite predictably to the AUKUS announcement. Some of you may read the Global Times. It's an English language official Chinese Communist Party publication. It generally takes a very hard public line. It ran an editorial the day after the AUKUS announcement, filled with vintage Cold War phraseology. Washington is losing its mind by trying to rally its allies against China, creating antagonism and destruction beyond its control. They still write like this in the Global Times. Significantly, the Global Times writers did not attack the United Kingdom in this editorial, but saved their strongest words for Australia. They were really savage in the treatment of Australia in this writing. If Australia acts with bravado to show its allegiance to the U.S. and takes the most prominent position in the U.S.'s anti-China strategy, especially by being militarily assertive, then Canberra will most likely become a target of Beijing's countermeasures so as to send a warning to the others. Thus, Australian troops are also most likely to be the first batch of Western soldiers to waste their lives in the South China Sea. Pretty strong stuff against Australia. There are reasons for this harsher Chinese treatment of Australia. China in recent years has directed against Australia an incredibly broad and sophisticated set of influence operations to undermine its deep alliance and longstanding alliance with the United States. As documented in a book in 2018 by Clive Hamilton called Silent Invasion, China has systematically used donations to Australian political parties, contributions to Australian universities, and many other similar means to bend Australian policies to favor China at the expense of the United States. A year ago, China officially and publicly presented to Australia a list of 14 grievances with Australian policies towards China. I mean, handed them a list saying this is what you're doing that we don't like. It said that changing these policies in China's favor would be, quote, conducive to a better atmosphere. And then in July of this year, after months of unexplained impediments to Australian exports to China, the Chinese official spokesman, Zhao Jian, stated, "We will not allow any country to reap benefits from doing business with China while groundlessly accusing and smearing China and undermining China's core interests based on ideology." So for China, the AUKUS Enhanced Security Partnership is clear proof that its campaign of diplomatic and economic pressure against Australia is not working. Far from bringing Australia to heel, it has caused Australia to resist. It heightened its cooperation with the United States. So these vituperative Chinese attacks are a mixture of anger on the one hand and sense of failure on the other hand. Now let's turn to France. And first, you need a little background here if you don't follow this on a year-to-year basis. In its defense white paper back in 2013, the Australian Labor government dismissed the acquisition of nuclear submarines in a single sentence without much detailed explanation. This rejection was criticized at the time by many commentators. They pointed out the advantages of nuclear submarines for Australia. It has huge maritime borders. The distances in the Western Pacific are long. And this makes nuclear submarines for a country like Australia far superior, if more expensive, than conventional propulsion. A nuclear submarine can travel submerged from one point to another within the Western Pacific in less than half the time it takes a non-nuclear submarine. In 2014, Japan's Prime Minister Abe Shinzo and the Australian Prime Minister, now Tony Abbott, leader of the opposition, the Liberal Party, which had been in opposition when the white paper was written, the two signed an agreement for the two countries to cooperate on building a Japanese submarine design, the Soryu class, in Australia. And then in 2016, the Australian government, now under Malcolm Turnbull, who ousted Prime Minister Abbott from the Liberal Party leadership, announced that following the competition with Japanese and German designs, it would purchase a non-nuclear submarine design from France and build them in Australia. So 2014, looks like Japan is going to build submarines in Australia. 2016, and in a surprise decision, France comes in and aces out both Japan and Germany. Prime Minister Turnbull said that the French design was recommended by Australia's Navy after extensive study in which senior American submarine officers also participated. Now the German, the Japanese, and the French were all perfectly good and proven submarine designs. Most observers of the surprising decision attributed the French win to its skill, its legendary skill, I would say, at competing for foreign arms sales contracts. The French really do pull out all the stops and all the champagne corks for big international arms sales, and this was a big one. On the other hand, for Japan, the submarine sale would have been its first major arms sale in its history after a recent decision by Japan, and its lack of experience showed. So France was feeling quite satisfied with itself, having pulled off, surprisingly, the win of a $50 billion contract from the odds-on favorite, Japan. There's one other important point to keep in mind. The sensor and weapon systems for this submarine were to be purchased from American companies. That is the sonar, the torpedoes, the missiles, the fire control systems. France was basically building the hull and propulsion systems to carry around American-built weapon systems and sensors. So that brings us to 2021 and the surprise announcement of the AUKUS security partnership and the Australian decision to purchase American nuclear submarines. Now I'm not inside anymore, so I really don't know if it was the United States that first approached Australia with the offer of nuclear technology, or whether Australia approached the United States first and asked. I suspect it was the latter, but it really is not significant once the idea came from whatever side it was there, and it was in discussion between the United States and Australia. In any case, once it was clear that the US was willing to provide nuclear propulsion systems, then it's entirely understandable that Australia would prefer these submarines and prefer fewer of them for the same budget if they are more expensive because of their ability to move so quickly around the theater. Now, at that point, the United States and Australia could, and I would say they should, have informed France that things had changed since 2016, that Australia had now decided to acquire nuclear submarines. They had decided to purchase American submarines, which are the best in the world. France would have been chagrined, but would have had little cause for resentment, because it would have more or less have done to itself what it had done to Japan 5 years before. However, the decisions to involve the United Kingdom and not to involve France in the trilateral security partnership setting for what was basically a change decision on a major arms sale is really less explicable, and I think ham-handed. In fact, President Biden himself called it clumsy. Just earlier this week, I think it was, when he talked with President Macron of France at the G20 summit in Rome. Neither France nor the United Kingdom is a major factor in the Pacific, but France, in fact, has been taking a greater presence in the Pacific than the UK. It has been less accommodating to Chinese blandishments than has the UK. A lot of that has been due to President Macron himself, who's been driving increased French deployments to the South China Sea. So he, quite understandably, and justifiably, I would say, felt insulted that France had not been invited to join the security partnership in the Pacific. An enhanced security partnership that left France out, along with breaking the contract for $50 billion worth of submarines, was a double gut punch. And I'd say it explains France's strong reaction. President Biden seems to have somewhat smoothed the incident over with President Macron, although it's still echoing. As recently as yesterday, charges of false statements and bad faith were flying back and forth between France and Australia. And I do think that the change of Australia's decision on the submarines could and should have been separated from the idea of a basically diplomatic enhanced security relationship that should have included France as well as the United Kingdom. So the only beneficiary of the flare-up among the United States, France, the UK, and Australia was, of course, China. Its anger was partially soothed by the spectacle of traditionally strong allies publicly blaming each other for bad faith. Over time, the furor will die down, and if China continues to ratchet up its pressure on the interests of all of these countries, they will continue to band together to oppose it. So that's the AUKUS story. But for the rest of my remarks this evening, let me move from the specifics of this incident to the overall security picture in the Asia-Pacific region, bringing in, as I promised earlier, philosophical, political, and economic factors. Let's start first with the economic factors. The basis of China's rise and its tremendously increased power in the Pacific and in the world these days has been its extraordinary economic development. Beginning about 1990, the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping set his country down a trail of economic development that had been well blazed in earlier decades by other Asian countries: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. The formula was to open their economies to the American and the larger Western market, and in every case, the economic development that these predecessor countries took off. China, however, overachieved these smaller predecessors when it started down the same. It surpassed Japan in 2010 as the world's second largest economy, and has been predicted by many to overtake the United States sometime in the 2020s. All of the countries of Asia, including Australia, developed heavy economic interdependence with China, basically exporting raw materials, as in the case of Australia, components of consumer products. Many of the Southeast Asian countries did this, and in turn, importing cheaper Chinese finished products. And in the process, China accumulated very large foreign reserves. Now, with these large imports, import dependence, many would say, and trade surpluses with many countries in the region, China believed it had developed political leverage, that the economic power had translated into political power. And although Australia would be the extreme case, China routinely used economic measures against Asian countries that it considered to have acted against its wishes. Examples include its refusal to import bananas from the Philippines because of a standoff over islands in the South China Sea in 2012. In the same year, China cut off rare earth metals from Japan following a dispute in the disputed Senkaku Islands. A third was a selective boycott of Korean businesses in 2017 when the Republic of Korea gave permission to the United States to deploy the THAAD missile system against North Korean missiles. Now, China has also attempted to use its economic power in positive ways to increase its influence, most notably through the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. China offers many countries in Asia, and as far as Europe, attractive terms for building transportation infrastructure, energy, gas, and oil transmission lines, maritime ports, and the like, and it expects in return sympathetic consideration of China's position on a range of issues. So China has attempted to turn its economic clout into political influence. If we turn to politics, there's a similar pattern. China had allocated a portion of its newfound wealth to its previously decrepit land-bound armed forces. It has rapidly developed an impressive Navy, Air Force, missile force, a combined cyber, space, and electronic warfare command, and it's building up its strategic nuclear forces. Now, China publicly defends its dramatic increases in its military capability, far and away the fastest growing military power in the world. It defends them as defensive. However, as is true with its economic diplomacy, China expects that other countries, considering the new and larger power of the People's Liberation Army, will trim their policies to accommodate Chinese preference. Within this overall expectation of deference, especially by its neighbors, China uses its armed forces in discrete actions to increase its territory, its authority, and its influence without triggering conflict, especially conflicts with the United States. China uses basically two approaches. The first is traditional gunboat diplomacy. For example, in recent months, and you may read about it in the paper, China has carried out a constant set of military maneuvers, sending airplanes all around Taiwan in order to put pressure on what it regards as a breakaway province. But second, China has developed a more sophisticated set of tactics which are known by various names, and the Chinese themselves call it cabbage soup. Just taking little pieces of the cabbage off and eventually you'll slice the whole thing. Various Chinese military and paramilitary organizations make small moves below the level of military aggression to extend Chinese authorities into neutral or disputed areas in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. These actions included things like the fortifications of disputed atolls in the South China Sea, the intrusion of large fishing fleets under military control, which are known as the People's Maritime Militia, into disputed territories with Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And on occasion, China has actually used military force against its neighbors. In June of last year, Chinese troops ambushed and killed an unarmed Indian colonel in their disputed area when that colonel was on his way to meet Chinese troops to negotiate the de-escalation of tensions. So military diplomacy has been a major Chinese approach in addition to the economic measures I talked about earlier. So too has been traditional international diplomacy as carried out by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Especially since about 2012 under Xi Jinping's leadership, overall Chinese politics have become nationalistic, strident, and its diplomatic approach has become aggressive and demanding. Xi has ordered his diplomats to demonstrate fighting spirit and to dare to show their swords. Interesting. Don't use it, show it. But the result has been an onslaught of harsh tweets from Chinese ambassadors, provocative public speeches, and actions like the presentation of 14 demands to Australia, which I mentioned earlier. And the Chinese diplomatic shotgun has widened in recent years. Over the past 2 years, China has insulted and made threats against not just Western democracies, but against Brazil, Kazakhstan, Iran, Pakistan, Venezuela, Thailand, and South Korea. So now we come to the final component of the PPE strategy, and that's philosophy. These aggressive Chinese economic, military, diplomatic, political actions are simply not having the success that Chinese leaders expected. The countries that they target resent Chinese pressure and are developing strategies to counter them and to push back. I talked earlier about the Australian reaction to the concerted Chinese campaign to influence operations, bully diplomacy, economic coercion. Australian leaders decided instead to double down on Australia's alliance with the United States and in fact upgrade their military capabilities. Japan is now openly discussing buying weapons that can strike China, supporting Taiwan in case of Chinese aggression, and reaching its traditional 1% of GDP limit on its military expenditures. And the reactions to China are not simply among American allies. India upgraded its transportation network into those disputed areas along its border with China, where the Indian colonel was killed. It stopped the purchase of Huawei telecommunications equipment. It canceled several major construction contracts with China. It publicly supported the AUKUS announcement, and it routinely sent ships into the South China Sea, all of which is claimed by China. Vietnam, traditional Chinese partner and ally, is building up its defense capabilities and upgrading its military relations with the United States. Europe has suspended ratification of the European Union-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. A commercial agreement that was 7 years in the making was all set to be ratified by both sides. The primary announced reason was the Chinese treatment of its Uyghur minority in Xinjiang, but the context was overall resistance to Chinese pressure. So how do we explain this backlash that Chinese policies have caused? Certainly, you cannot explain it by economics. It goes against economic sense in many cases. You can only partially, I would say, explain it by politics. I believe it comes down to basic considerations that are more the province of philosophy than the politics or economics. Thucydides Greek writing, 2,500 years ago, was not just called a historian, but a war philosopher. And it was he who identified the three basic motivations of war. And we learned from Clausewitz that war and politics are pretty interchangeable. But he identified the three as interest, which is clearly the domain of politics, but also, and more important, honor and fear, which are more the domain of philosophy. Countries, like people, prefer to determine their own futures. They resent pressure coming from other nations, pressure that runs against what they see as their own interests, their own preferences. And as long as they can, they will act to counter hostile pressure and to make their own decisions. Now, China neglects these considerations, or else thinks it can overcome them, overcome the resentment, counter the reactions that its aggressive policies are causing in other countries. What is so ironic, I think it's so ironic, and I talked about it with Chinese friends, is that China itself was the victim of harsh economic, military, and diplomatic pressure from other countries for what it calls its century of humiliation. That is, from the first Opium War up through the formation of the Chinese state under communism in 1949. So China endured this century of humiliation when European countries, Japan, and to a lesser extent the United States, carved out concessions in China and imposed humiliating conditions on the failing Qing Empire. And China, when it developed the means to do so, defended its independence throughout the foreigners. I'll never be in that position again. And good for them. And yet somehow China expects other countries to act completely differently, to make concessions, to limit their sovereignty, and to allow China to dictate their important policies against what they perceive as their interests. I think that China is badly misreading its neighbors, both near and far. And while accusing the United States of pursuing a policy that contains China, it is in fact China that is containing itself. Marxist analysis and plain hubris are combining the blind Chinese leaders to the basic nature of independent countries. They will resist being pushed around if they have any means to do so. And they will start resisting again with pressure excuses. With the security networks that the United States and many other countries in the region are building, there are, in fact, now many ways for other countries to resist Chinese pressure. So the Asia-Pacific region today is the most dynamic in the world, economically, militarily, politically, and we could add, although we have not discussed it, environmentally. Events in that part of the globe are the most important factor in the future of the entire international system. And to understand what is going on in this region, to formulate American policy that will support our interests and continue developing a secure, peaceful future for the Asia-Pacific, we must use this sort of multidimensional approach, combining the methods and insights from many different academic disciplines: history, economics, politics, anthropology, other cultural studies, philosophy. And I would say that's worthy work for everybody from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill undergraduates to the National Security Council. So thanks very much, and I look forward to turning this into a discussion.
Okay, how about if we do it? Restart? Should I let you just take the question? Okay. So if you have a question, ask away.
Hi, Blair, thanks. If I understand correctly, right, so the Australia-UK-US agreement is in large part a technology sharing agreement. And I understand why the US wants to sell nuclear submarines to Australia and why Australia wants to buy them. What role does the UK play in all of this? Why are they involved?
Yeah. So the question is, it's pretty easy to understand the US-Australian component of this, but the UK come into it. I think it would be interesting to see mechanically how it worked, but I would guess that it came out of the pretty close US-UK relations and the Australia-UK relations, so it seemed natural for them to make it a threesome rather than a twosome. I mean, United Kingdom does want to have a Pacific profile. United Kingdom really wants to sell Australia equipment, which it does some of, as well as having just the Americans sell it to them. But I got to tell you that I don't think the staff on the National Security Council and the State Department were thinking clearly when they just brought only the UK in and didn't think more widely. So I kind of contribute to old muscle movements without hard thinking about it. As I said, I think we should have separated the technology from the diplomatic end of it. And if we're going to, and I think it's a good idea to bring European countries into enhanced security frameworks, but we should have offered it to more than just the UK, which is a relatively minor actor. So I think it's that combination of things. Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. So I guess like two quick questions. One is, can you quickly comment on what seems to be like a recent change? Maybe it's not that recent, but maybe it seems like a recent sudden change in Chinese diplomatic tone. That is, back in the day when Deng Xiaoping was the chairman, he famously said, "Ideal strength, ideal time." But now when Xi Jinping came into power, it seems to be sudden. It seems quite sudden to me, but maybe not. Maybe you've seen the sign. Suddenly more assertive. Is it just explained by sort of the economic maturity of China now? It seems, now we're an economic power, we could be more assertive, or is there, some other explanation, maybe it's personality or some need of the Communist Party to, assert its legitimacy by going down this more aggressive diplomatic route? Second question is, there is one sentence in your talk which I might have misheard you, which is, it's not the other countries are containing China, but it seems China is containing itself. Maybe I think that's something. So I was thinking, from the perspective of China, given the American presence and the presence of the kind of security networks you were talking about, which existed for a long time, the island chain system that tries to contain China into its coastal water rather than going to the Pacific. Do you sort of see the argument that they need to break through this existing system, which, like you said, is like the Baltimore rule? Like, we're not going to mention China, but we all know that's the party we're trying to contain. What should they do in that situation? Like, what's the best avenue for them to move forward if they want more of a role in global affairs and assert their power? Thank you.
Right, and those are related questions, I think. On the first one, why did China make this switch to a more aggressive set of policies, which they did around 2012? There was always a faction within China. Well, go back a sec. It's so ironic. Until about 2012, we the Americans, and I was in government at the time, were worried about this clever skill of the Chinese, who were not looking very aggressive, who were being very soft-handed, and they were gaining all sorts of influence within particularly Southeast Asian countries. Southeast Asia is kind of the canary in the cage in U.S.-Chinese relations. You can tell how things are going. And we were gnashing our teeth because Chinese ambassadors were being appointed who spoke the language of the country. We're building up economic relations, and we're talking about a shared future, and then come up with a plan to mediate the South China Sea disputes. And darn, we, the United States, are being pushed out by Chinese soft power. If you read the internal Chinese documents, not only the secret ones, but also open ones, there was a faction within China at that time that said this soft approach is terrible. It's never going to work. You got to be hard. That's just the way things work in the world. So I think two events happened that basically helped those who were advising Chinese leadership to take a harder line. The first was the Chinese Olympics in 2008, was it? 2008 Olympics. Sort of a coming out party for Asian countries. Hosting an Olympics and doing it well is sort of a maturity, rite of passage. Happened in Korea, I mean, happened in Japan first in 1960, happened in Korea, now in Japan. So you think that, hey, we're one of the big guys now. Second thing was the self-inflicted financial crisis in 2008, 2009 that the United States started, spread to the rest of the world, and China, in fact, uniquely was not affected by it, and China actually gave assistance to other countries to help them get through it. And so the Chinese thought, hey, these Americans, we always thought that they knew how to run the world from an economic and financial point of view, and they blew it. They created their own country and a lot of other countries. So I think those two events sort of in Chinese mindset, why are we thinking that we're just going to join a US system and gradually change it? We have some better ideas, we have the skill, we have the money and all. So I think that was part of it. And then I think Xi Jinping himself was a part of it. Remember, and in fact, this is the one thing that worried me. The Chinese system from Deng Xiaoping on was very clear that a leader would only go 10 years, move on, fresh blood would come up, and frankly, as I watched it, the new fresh blood in China was more talented than the people whose place they took. They were engineers, they were economists, they really knew what they were doing, and I thought that was a real strength of the Chinese system, which is, like most dictatorships, there's a built-in attraction for the people at the top to fall in love with what they see in the mirror. They figure they ought to stay a little longer, nobody can replace them, but China had resisted this ever since Mao, partly because of Mao. But all of a sudden, in 2012, this guy Xi Jinping came to be in power, younger, had not really experienced, did not really have this experience of the hard times in China, really came of age in a period when China was rapidly growing. Why do we pay any attention to the United States? And I kind of think that I'm indispensable for China. So I think all of those things led to this harder edge that we've seen since 2012. So that was sort of the way it developed. I'm not sure I answered the second question as well, which was more on.
Yeah, you're in the state council, and she said, "Find us a way to break through the current state."
Yeah.
Like, what are we gonna do?
So it's interesting. If you look at a map of China, or if you look at a map that has China centered and is facing east, you see basically islands dominated by allies of the United States, heading it in. Korea Peninsula, the Half Island, that headed in, the Japanese archipelago, down the Philippines, all allies of the United States. And China doesn't think like a maritime country, it thinks like a continental country. It thinks you either own it or somebody bad owns it. It doesn't have the concept that the blue part of the map, the water space, the airspace over water space, is somehow international territory that everybody can travel on. They want to, if not own it, at least influence it. So I think their way of thinking is that I've got to have a veto, at least a veto, over the policies of these countries when they're doing something that I think is against the Chinese interest in order to be safe. So that's sort of what they're pushing towards. And I think that what they're neglecting is the 50 years or so of history in which the United States was military dominant in that region, but kind of didn't much care about using that dominance. Lee Kuan Yew is one of the Asian leaders that I respect the most and listen to the most. And if you read his book about the United States, the chapter on the United States, it basically says, you know, if you got to have an Asian country that's more powerful than most others, the United States is probably better than any other. Number one, they're far away. Number two, they don't care much. They just sort of let people do what they want. And so I think ever since the United States got out of Vietnam in 1975, that's sort of been the case in Asia. The United States kept bad things from happening, but other things could sort of go along and countries develop economically, politically. And China decided that it was rivaling the United States, and it was sort of not the right thing to do to take advantage of that system, but it needed to create its own system, break through the geographical barriers, break through the economic barriers, really be recognized, at least within the region, as dominant there. So that's the best explanation I have. So it's pretty fundamental on the Chinese side too. Sir.
So how do you envision China's diplomatic relationship with the US to develop, for example, from now to until she finishes disaster? And
I'm sorry, I hear it's positive. Go ahead.
how do you envision the Chinese and American diplomatic relationship to develop from this point on towards when Xi Jinping finishes disaster? And do you think China's invasion of Taiwan is ultimately inevitable, or is it to be prevented by certain?
Right. Let me answer the second question first, because I think the answer to the first question depends on the second question. The question was, do I think that a military invasion of Taiwan by China is inevitable? No, I don't. And I think I know more about it than anybody but about 2 or 3 other people in the world. So it's something I was responsible for, I thought about a lot. A Chinese military invasion of Taiwan would be an extremely high-risk military operation. Just from a technical military point of view. Think the invasion of Normandy, 1944. But doing that first thing out of the box with no preparation. I mean, the United States, United Kingdom made an awful lot of mistakes during the 4 years that preceded Normandy in order to learn about invading countries. First American shot in Europe, Operation Torch in North Africa, was a disaster. Across the Pacific were a range of very difficult things. And for China to expect that it can come up with a standing start, China has never done an amphibious or airborne assault of this scale. They practice it a lot, but I can tell you practicing is not the same as doing it when the bullets are flying and people are dying. So it's just extremely high risk from their point of view, despite all of their rhetoric. And when they close the door and really look at it, they say, this is tough. And it can continue to be tough with the actions that Taiwan takes, and the United States is obligated to provide Taiwan weapons assistance to do it. You can make it just a real roll of the dice for China to do that. And so if you're a Chinese leader, you think, do I do this high risk maneuver? Or do I do what I've been doing before, which is just building up my power, building up my economic power, my military power, and just giving the sense of inevitability that Taiwan has to reach some sort of a different agreement. And so far, I think the Chinese have always come along on that second alternative, not rolling the dice. And I've heard Jiang Zemin say, I'm going to solve this before I leave at the end of my time, and then decided not to. Now you hear Xi Jinping talking about having to have to solve it. I just think that's big talk. Now it's dangerous big talk. This is your bluff calling, and you may have to, you may be driven to do something stupid, but I really don't think so, especially because not only would the economic and military effects on China be devastating in the short term, but if they didn't succeed, probably in the short term, many Chinese would ask, well, what are you good for anyway? You've been talking about this all this time. You made a try, you failed. We're going to get a new set of bosses. So I think that there will not be a military confrontation there, or there may be a confrontation, there won't be an invasion. So what does that mean for the future of U.S. and China relations? relations. And let me say what it's not. You know, it's not a Cold War that has to end in one side or the other collapsing. Our economic relations with China, our human relations with China. I mean, how many Chinese students are here at UNC Chapel Hill? How many American students are over in Tsinghua and Beijing University? That was never true with Russia, with the Soviet Union. The economic relations are, dude, it's so interesting. When I'm in meetings with American government officials, Chinese government officials, American businessmen, Chinese businessmen, all the nastiness is at the government official side. The business people are talking away, cutting deals, all sorts of things. So, you know, it's not fated to be some sort of a negative relationship. I think it does require more adjustment on the Chinese side than it does on the American side. I think if the Chinese start thinking the way I implied they should in the remarks I made, that this hard edge is just not working, we're just causing resentment against us. Let's go back to softer ways and let's try to dominate this system by making people want to work with us rather than pointing a gun at them. I think it can be. I think they can be much more successful, and relations with the United States can be great. If the Chinese push the United States off the world stage because they offer a more attractive model, their economy works better, they make these commanding heights of technology and all, good for them. Good for them. You know, that's a fair fight. And if China can win that fight, and other countries say, you know, that's the model I want to follow. Good for them. So I think if China realizes the advantages of competing in other ways and realizes the real dangers of trying military pressure, coercion, and much less action, then I think that you know, it'll be one of these competitive cooperative relationships that can go in any direction. And the relations may not be bad. That'd be my hope anyway. And if I had to bet, you know, red or black, you only get to choose one. I would bet on that economic cooperation, economic competition, and not military conflict. Yes, ma'am.
You interestingly
Sir,
mentioned
excuse me.
this set of losses. How likely do you think, or how precarious is the CCP's position, and how much do you see that as playing into this tension?
Yeah, I don't know. The Chinese Communist Party has awfully well developed tools of keeping control, police, armed forces. They've uniquely been able to take the information technology revolution and turn it to control rather than freedom. So I don't see any possibility of popular discontent unseating the Chinese Communist Party. I think the real competition is among the elites within China, and I've got to believe that the Chinese elites are having the same discussion that we're having in this room today. Are we on the right track? What's the right thing for the country? And I think that there's a debate over the merits of the case. And in fact, the papers that are circulated among Chinese leaders are pretty frank and open to discuss these things in pretty open terms. What do we want to do? Which way? There's not much ideology in it. And so they're thinking about this stuff. And the merits of the case really matter. I think another dynamic, though, is leadership and leadership succession. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, Xi Jinping declared that he's going to be the leader for life. It's a terrible thing as far as most Chinese officials go. You know, where's the promotion opportunity now? You know, you got to be Xi or you got to be a friend of Xi in order in order to get ahead. And why should I have real loyalty to that kind of a setup? So I think by this, and all of, and you do glimmers of this break out into even into the open press. She has pulled a huge amount of power into his personal stuff, into his person. And so people sit around and, you know, can we get our issue into the leading group on, you name the topic? Probably not gonna happen. They're only 24 hours in a day, you can't get that much done. So there's pretty good personal discontent, I would say, within the next couple of echelons of Chinese leadership, because it's debate on the merits. And so if there is to be change in China, I think it'll come out of that dynamic. And I think there will be. I mean, my impression of it, you know, Henry Kissinger, who's admirable in many ways, I just don't agree with him that China has this long-term 1,000-year plan that they're sort of working on, whether it's the Qing dynasty or the Ming dynasty before it or the Communist Party. I think they're very practical people who sort of make up policies that seem to them to work. They pursue them if they're working. If they don't, they change them. And so I sort of count on this sort of practical approach of Chinese leaders to sort this out. And if the United States plays its cards properly, which is not to go poke a stick in China's eye, but to be firm about the things that we develop, then that gives China the opportunity to make its own decisions. And I think it will make a difference. So that would be my guess. Sir.
How should the United States go about building more credible deterrence? I mean, that could be militarily, politically, economically. I guess which route should it choose, or all three? Kind of where should those efforts develop?
The best thing with building military power is to do it and not talk about it. And we were in an enviable position when I was the military commander. We did have superiority in many ways, and we just didn't talk about it. It just provided the basis, knowing that if there were a military confrontation over Taiwan, the United States would win, China would lose, be a lot of damage, a lot of destruction on all sides. At the end of the day, that would be the result. Then let's talk about other things, economic cooperation, diplomatic, and I think that's the right approach. So all of this public debate about we have to do this militarily and China's making progress on that, I think that's not helping. So I would just do the military stuff, have a quiet confidence that you can keep it high risk for China to invade Taiwan, and that takes care of the military side. On the economic side, I think you've got to deal with China went down a path that the United States followed in the 1870s. I mean, we were the worst intellectual property thieves in the world. Charles Dickens had his books published in the thousands by multiple American publishing companies and never got a nickel for them. China has been playing this game of we're just a poor developing country, so we need to have all of these breaks from new developed countries, and they've managed to take advantage of the World Trading System rules much to their advantage. And we just have to set the rules and say, no, here's what you do. If you want to use somebody else's intellectual property, you have to get a royalty agreement for it. If you're going to close your market to American telecom companies, we're going to close the American market to yours. These are the rules. So we've got to get the economic relations more balanced on the economic side. And if we do both of those, then on the diplomatic side, I think things just get a lot easier, and we can compete diplomatically using the traditional things. What can we do for other countries that make us want us to help them rather than China want to help them, and vice versa from China's point of view. So I think that's the way we ought to approach it. And
Hard to do that in the political climate in the hard to do anything in the political climate in the United States right now, frankly, but awfully hard to do something like that. But I think if you talk to the professionals in the business behind the scenes, what I said would probably ring pretty true, and that's what they're thinking about, whatever comes out in the press and in the statements.
Okay, thank you.
Up and away back, yeah.
So, from my understanding,
I'm sorry, let me get a little bit closer and, new hearing aids next week, but. Yeah.
so what I understand from the conflict is that from Biden's perspective, he wanted to address kind of the imbalances or the lack of balance without about how everything to fix China's problem and everything like that, but I think that campaign got a little bit more shallow. I know that Biden could have used that lack of fulfillment of promise as a motivator to initiate a stronger response in terms of the deal with Australia. So given that context, and what you previously said though about how it is in America's best interest, kind of have a silent approach to the strength of the army, the military, how do those two coincide? Wanting to make a strong appearance in terms of not backing down from China, yet also wanting to maintain a formal appearance and not necessarily really formal.
Right. So that was a very good question. The question was, if I'm advising people to make your military moves quietly, not to poke a stick in China's eye, how can an American politician carry out that policy when you get rewarded by poking sticks in people's eyes and speaking loudly and making more out of things than they are? And I think the answer is you've got to get control of your bureaucracy, and you've got to make those decisions right at the very top, at the president's level. Now, with President Trump, of course, there was almost no hope of doing that. He felt he was the smartest person in the room on China and everything else, and so he was going to talk about it. That there's got to be rich material in the things that he would say on foreign policy, as well as any form of domestic policy that would at least cause countries like China anxiety, if not downright worry. I discount this phone call that General Milley made to General Lee about before the election. I mean, that was kind of silly. I thought, I don't believe that China served any serious analysts in China, and they had some good analysts at the United States who they listened to. None of those really thought the United States was preparing to do a wag the dog attack against China as Trump was leaving office. But nonetheless, I think it's indicative of the way all sorts of countries and people reacted to President Trump. This guy could really do something nuts here. So let's put the Trump administration aside. The Obama administration and President Obama himself sort of had this idea that if I talk to President Xi and explain to him why it's in his interest to act in this restrained way, I can convince him personally, and China will act in a different way. I think that was pretty hopelessly naive in another way, in a different way. And my experience is you just don't talk leaders of other countries into doing something that is against the way that they've decided to do for a combination of internal and external reasons. So President Obama's idea, I thought, was more or less, well, there's this teenage kid, China, that's growing up, and we'll sort of coach him how to be a responsible adult. I mean, it was pretty condescending, frankly, and China wasn't buying it. So that was sort of the Obama approach. Now, I think you're right. President Biden has a chance to sort of reset things. Every new leader does. And if you look at the moves that he's taken, what his first action was a video teleconference, the Quad Summit, when he was on Zoom with the president of India, Japan, and Australia. Okay, you know, that's not bad, and they never mentioned the word China, which is okay, but it's pretty clearly part of this network approach that I said. And then I agree with you that the AUKUS deal was sort of held secretly, and then sort of the rabbit was pulled out of the hat in a way that was guaranteed to antagonize China. And so, again, President Biden's people couldn't quite help themselves to do something that showed that they were not doing what President Trump did, but it was with allies, not just a unilateral announcement. It was something solid. So I think they couldn't resist this shiny object of this treaty. I'm hoping that they'll settle down, and I think President Biden is more temperamentally suited to settling down. I don't think he thinks that he can lecture President Xi the way President Obama did. He certainly doesn't want to be a President Trump and surprise them all. So I think if we give it a little time, it'll probably be more of an even policy. And President Biden does like to talk to people, enemies, friends, strangers. So that's a good thing. And he and President Xi can have, the more they talk, the better it is, I think, for sort of smoothing out the relations. So I think that the overall projection for the Biden administration to have a reasonable Chinese policy is pretty good. But for a number of reasons, the AUKUS incident was probably not the best part of it. Let's see if there's anybody else in the way back. Yeah.
I was just wondering what kind of moves that China had in terms of exercising soft power around the world. Like how we have NATO and this new agreement with the UK and Australia. What kind of abilities they have to exercise their policies abroad.
So the question is about China's soft power in the world. Yeah. China dictatorships have hijacked so many of the terms of democracy, and soft power is another word that they've hijacked. I'm sure you've had to read Joseph Nye's book, which explains soft power, and it's an attractive power based on example. It's what it fundamentally is. China has basically said anything that's not using force is soft power, and throwing money around is a soft power technique. And China has a lot of money, money is attractive, therefore we have soft power. So the Chinese definition of soft power is by and large economically driven. Why? Because China really doesn't have much attractive power. The example that other countries in the region or in the world, most other countries, are influenced by. I think there's a great deal of admiration for China and what it's done in terms of getting rid of all these foreign influences, building up its economy, making sacrifices, all of that. So China has respect. It has admiration in some areas. But when other countries look at China and say, do I want to be like that? Is the Chinese example relevant to the kind of ambitions I have? You don't see much of that, except in selected countries, like maybe North Korea or Cambodia or a few other pieces. So, I think if you go to almost any other Asian country, they would say, which would you rather be influenced by? America at its best or China at its best? They'd almost always say America at its best, but if you guys go away, if the Chinese economic juggernaut continues, we're going to have to deal with them. We're going to have to find ways to deal with them economically. We're going to have to find ways to deal with them from a power point of view. Now, I don't think that's so much soft power as soft fear. I would say. It's not to say that that's not for all time. What's the most vibrant democracy in Asia right now? I would say it's Taiwan. Can't call Taiwan a country, that's a convention, but if you talk to Taiwanese politicians, I mean, they really believe it's representative democratic government stuff. Everybody votes, heavy campaigns, they really fight it out, and they don't have the cynical veneer that we have adopted in the United States, in which we've been so tactical about politics. They argue it out on the issues, on personalities, on the people. It's sort of refreshing. So it's not that Han-Chinese people cannot be admirable in democratic, representative, inventing new ways to have representative government kind of ways. But until they do that, I don't think other countries will look at China as a representative form of government or political development. I think they will mainly look at China as an economic success story to be feared or taken advantage of, depending on what your situation is. So I'd say that's the way I feel about Chinese soft power, despite what they say. Yeah.
My income studies professor had a perspective that I was sort of surprised about regarding China, that the Biden administration isn't doing a good job of gaining leverage from China in a way that the Trump administration was better about, because Biden is backing China into a corner by not willing to give up on any American interests with China, whereas Trump was more willing to say turn away from human rights atrocities committed by the Chinese government to get what they wanted in terms of trade or something. So I'm curious about not to say obviously that Trump was doing a good job, but just where does that leave China when America isn't gonna let up on any aspect of their relationship with China, when China is such a powerful are there any places where the US could let China win in order to get other things? Is that even part of the conversation?
Yeah, I think it is. If you're a man from Mars and you come down and look at the American-Chinese situation, you'd say, what are you two guys all riled up about? There's plenty of power, there's plenty of influence, there's plenty of economic, there's plenty of relations for all of you. Why are you so much at odds? And if you look at the actual hotspots that could result in war, Taiwan is sort of odd in world history when you think about it. This is not Alsace-Lorraine with Germany claiming it on the one hand, France claiming it on the other hand, trading back and forth in wars and getting ready to fight it again. The Chinese historical claim to Taiwan is pretty shaky. When you actually look at it historically, the Taiwanese people were separate. They were not Han-Chinese. Japan was the one that mainly took them over. And then China didn't come in in big numbers until Chiang Kai-shek came across the channel there. So it's a shaky thing there, but it looks to the Chinese like, well, it's island 70 miles off our coast, a bunch of Chinese on it, that ought to be ours. I mean, the American claim on Taiwan is also sort of subtle. I mean, we do not guarantee Taiwan's independence. We do not have a defense treaty for Taiwan. What the Taiwan Relations Act says, and this is very important, is the United States regards the settlement of any issue having to do with Taiwan as requiring peaceful means. So we specifically or we say it the other way really in the language. It says the actions on Taiwan by non-peaceful means will be a matter of great concern to the United States. That's what the words are. I mean, that's not a defense treaty either. It's a sort of a semi-guarantee depending on how things start. So the one place where we really are militarily lined up, we have a war plan for defending Taiwan. The Chinese have a war plan for taking it. Is an island to which the Chinese have a shaky claim, and the United States have an ambiguous commitment. You know, that's not the Cold War. That's not communism versus capitalism. That's a bump and grind point that's been managed for 50 years. It should be able to manage for 50 more. So it doesn't take genius statecraft to keep the United States and China from fighting each other. It just takes common sense and not getting carried away. So I think that you know, that's the fundamental situation when you get away from the headlines. Now, as far as individual pieces go, each administration sort of learns from the one before it. So it's not that East Asia policy is not like the Middle East policy. I used to sit out in the Pacific, and I really feel sorry for my friends who are dealing in the Middle East, because Middle East policy is so difficult and changeable that each new administration comes in and thinks it can completely change it. Our Asia policy has been pretty consistent. Michael Green, probably the foremost authority on it, argues that our policy has been pretty consistent since 1783. And it's certainly been pretty consistent, I'd say, since 1975 when we finally got out of Vietnam. And so the Biden administration came in and it inherited these tariffs that the Trump administration put in. And remember, Trump administration, the thing that the United States was worried about in trade with China was not really tariffs. It was intellectual property. It was subsidies to Chinese companies. It was unfair trading practices. It wasn't really just the price of goods. But President Trump loved tariffs, and he put the big tariffs on. And then we started talking with the Chinese about these individual issues: intellectual property, government subsidies, unfair trading practices, adherence to WTO standards, WTO standards, and so on. And those talks made a certain amount of progress, and then they fell apart. China walked away. So I think there's a structure there for the Biden administration, and U.S. Trade Representative Dotson Kai is a very accomplished, experienced person to go back in and negotiate these individual economic issues in a smart way. So in that way, they inherited something good from the Trump administration on a major problem. I think on the military side, and I was in the room for a lot of this. Revisionist history now says that the United States from 1990s through 2016 thought that if we just left China alone, talked to them nicely, brought them into the World Trade Organization, they would throw us into a responsible stakeholder in global trade. And all of the Americans who participated in that policy were hopelessly naive. China was going to get a hard edge, it was inevitable. Why didn't we know it back in 1990 and begin to oppose them from there? And that's just frankly nonsense. The United States thought in the Clinton years, in the Obama years, that there were two paths that China could go on. It could basically try to work within the American system and change from the inside, or it could make a more overt challenge to it. And that the smarter policy was to see if China would adopt this other approach and follow consistently, and therefore downplay the military side of it and try to work it economically. And yet, the United States did not neglect the hedging aspects of increasing our military power in Western Pacific and Asia, keeping relations with allies close. So the United States, when China took this change of approach in 2012, was in a pretty good position to be able to adjust its approach. So I think there's a nice flexible set of tools, military, economic, diplomatic. China is, one thing about China, you can see it coming from a long way. You know, they don't do subtle real well. And so you can adjust these diplomatic military positions. And I think the Biden administration has some smart people in it who've been dealing with China a long time. I don't think they handled the AUKUS deal as well as I would have expected. People like Kurt Campbell, people like Eli Ratner, people like Jake Sullivan, the vice president himself, for heaven's sake, has been involved in foreign policy for these many years, and yet even he gets Taiwan policy wrong in a public statement, CNN town hall meeting. I mean, that's a little distressing. Except he's 4 years older than I am, so I have to give him something. So I think they've got the right people. They've got tools that they can work with. This is not a desperate situation, and so I think it can work out better than what you read in a lot of the articles, either in the Global Times or on Fox News. How are we doing?
Please, we're doing perfectly. I think there is pizza outside. We've had some really good questions and discussion. Let's thank our speaker.